The world Seo Jinho knew ended on a Wednesday. It began, as cruel ironies often do, with hope. He stood in the pale fluorescent light of a private medical clinic in Seoul, a small folded paper tucked inside his jacket pocket, pressed flat against his heartbeat. The doctor had confirmed what he had barely dared to believe: the surrogacy agreement he had spent months carefully arranging, the embryo transfer he had undergone as a single intended parent before he even met Kang Woohyun. It had worked. He was carrying a life. Their life now. The baby he had dreamed of was real, growing quietly inside him like a secret too precious for words. He had rewritten the story in his head 100 times on the taxi ride over. Woohyun would look up from his desk, that severe handsome face cracking open with wonder. He would come around the desk. He would pull Jinho close and say "we," and Jinho would finally stop being alone in his hope. Kang Woohyun was everything a man like Jinho, quiet, artistic, allergic to ambition, had never expected to fall in love with. A tech empire CEO before 35. Cold in boardrooms and devastating at dinner parties. Jinho had told himself the coldness was a shell. He had spent 2 years polishing that shell, certain there was warmth underneath. The lobby of Woohyun's company tower smelled like marble and expensive air. The receptionist waved him through without a word. He had done this 100 times. The elevator ride was 30 floors of nervous, joyful terror. But when Jinho stepped into the executive suite, the warmth he expected was gone. Woohyun stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, back turned, hands clasped, staring at the skyline like a general surveying land he intended to conquer. He didn't turn around when Jinho said his name. He didn't turn around for a long time. When he finally did, his eyes were the eyes of a stranger. "Jinho." His voice was a legal document. "I need to tell you something." Jinho's hand moved instinctively to his stomach. "I need to tell you something first. I'm merging with Shin Group." Woohyun said it the way you announce a quarterly result. "Their chairman has one condition. I marry his daughter by the end of the year. It's non-negotiable." The room seemed to tilt. "We're together," Jinho said, the words coming out thin and strange as if he were reminding someone of a basic fact about the weather. "We've been together for 2 years. You gave me a key to your apartment." Woohyun's face didn't move. "That was personal. This is business. Woohyun. I need someone who can stand beside me at the level I operate at." He said it gently, which was somehow worse than cruelty. Gentle, the way you euthanize something. "You're a good person, Jinho. But you're a burden to where I'm going. You understand?" Burden. The word landed like a stone thrown through glass. Jinho reached into his jacket pocket. He held out the folded paper, the clinic report, the confirmation, the proof that something extraordinary and irreversible had already begun. Woohyun looked at it the way you look at a bill you have no intention of paying. He didn't take it. "My assistant will arrange for your things to be collected," he said, and walked back to his desk. Jinho stood there a moment longer, the paper still extended, his arm beginning to tremble. Then he lowered it, tucked it back into his pocket, and walked out. He made it as far as the lobby before his legs gave out. The last thing he registered before the marble floor rushed up to meet him was the sound of Woohyun's receptionist saying his name. Then silence. Then nothing. Chapter 2: The Unexpected Rescue. He woke to the smell of roasted barley tea and old books. The ceiling above him was low and wooden, not the brushed steel of Woohyun's apartment. Afternoon light came through linen curtains. Somewhere, a record was playing, something acoustic and unhurried. Jinho sat up too fast and immediately regretted it. "Easy." A man appeared in the doorway. Tall, with the kind of quiet build that suggested physical work rather than a gym membership. He was carrying a ceramic mug, and he set it on the nightstand with the careful deliberateness of someone accustomed to handling fragile things. "You fainted in the lobby. The paramedics cleared you, but your blood pressure was low. I brought you here." Jinho looked at him properly and felt his stomach turn over for an entirely different reason. Ha-Isul. He knew the name before he knew the face, because Woohyun said it the way men say the name of everything they resent. Ha-Isul's company poached our lead developer. Ha-Isul's new platform is undercutting our pricing. Ha-Isul, spoken like a bruise being pressed. The rival. The thorn in the side of Woohyun's perfectly engineered empire. In person he looked nothing like a thorn. He looked like someone who had learned the world at a slower pace and found it more interesting that way. "I know who you are," Jinho said. I know who you are too. Isul pulled a low chair to the bedside and sat down, not crowding him. Are you hungry? I made juk. You cooked. I live here. A faint smile. I tend to cook in places I live. Jinho stared at him. Why did you bring me here? You and Woohyun, your enemies? That's his word, not mine. Isul wrapped his hands around his own mug. I saw someone collapse. I helped. The rest of it is just business. The apartment, if it could be called that, it felt more like a converted workshop, all exposed brick and bookshelves and afternoon light, was warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. There were no surfaces performing luxury. The couch had a blanket draped over the back of it. There was a plant in the corner that had clearly been there for years and been spoken to occasionally. Jinho ate the juk Isul brought him. He couldn't think of anything else to do. You can stay until you're stable, Isul said from the kitchen. No strings. I have a spare room. Jinho looked down at his hands. Burden Woohyun had said. I don't want to be a bother, he said carefully. Isul appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. He looked at Jinho with an expression that was impossible to categorize. Not pity, not curiosity, something more like recognition. As if he had seen someone use that particular phrase before and knew exactly what it was a symptom of. You're not, he said simply and went back to washing the pot. The hospital the next morning confirmed what the clinic had already told him. The pregnancy was progressing. His blood pressure needed monitoring. He was to avoid stress, a prescription so absurd given the circumstances that the doctor seemed to hear it too, and had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Isul drove him. He sat in the waiting room with a paperback, not asking questions, not performing concern. When the nurses recognized Jinho from the gossip columns and whispered behind clipboards, "Isn't that the one Kang Woohyun abandoned?" Isul either didn't hear or decided not to. He paid for the prescriptions at the pharmacy counter without being asked and handed Jinho the paper bag in the car without making it a moment. You don't have to do this, Jinho said. I know. I can find somewhere else to stay. You can, Isul agreed. But you've been awake for 30 hours and your blood pressure is still unstable, so perhaps not today. Jinho looked out the window at Seoul sliding past. He had nowhere to go. His apartment had been Woohyun's apartment. His friendships had calcified around Woohyun's social calendar. His life, he was realizing with a hollow nausea, had been constructed entirely around someone else's blueprints. That evening, he was looking for a glass of water when he heard Isul on a call in the study. I don't care what it costs the company's reputation, Isul was saying, his voice low. Kang Woohyun is going to use every connection he has to bury Jinho in the press. I need to be ready to respond. Whatever it takes. Jinho stood in the hallway, a hand pressed to the wall. The man who was supposed to be his enemy was the only person in Seoul who had used his name like it mattered tonight. He didn't know what to do with that. He went back to bed and lay there for a long time in the dark, the paper from the clinic folded on the nightstand beside him, the tea Isul had left going cold. Living with Isul was disorienting in a way Jinho hadn't anticipated. Woohyun's affection had always been an event. Dinners with reservations made weeks in advance. Gifts in boxes with ribbons. Affection that had a schedule and a set dressing. It had felt like love because it was so visible. Isul's care was invisible in the way oxygen is invisible, you only noticed it when you thought about breathing. He left a glass of room-temperature water on Jinho's nightstand every morning before he left for his office, because cold water in the first trimester made Jinho's nausea worse and he had only mentioned it once, offhandedly, a week ago. He kept crackers in the kitchen cabinet at eye level without saying anything about it. When Jinho woke at 2 in the morning rigid with a craving for convenience store ramen, Isul appeared from his room in a gray t-shirt and track pants, already reaching for his keys, saying nothing except spicy or mild? You don't have to, Jinho started. Mild it is, Isul said and went to get his shoes. But there was something else too. A tension that lived in the apartment alongside them like a third presence. Jinho caught Isul watching him sometimes, not intrusively, not possessively, but with a careful, unguarded attention that made Jinho's chest do things he wasn't ready to examine. And Isul would look away with the unhurried ease of someone who wasn't embarrassed to have been caught, only thoughtful. Meanwhile, Woohyun had not been quiet. The articles started the second week. A news site known for corporate gossip ran a piece painting Jinho as a social climber who had attached himself to Woohyun for access and connections. 2 days later, a lifestyle magazine, clearly fed by Woohyun's PR team, published a glowing profile of his new engagement to Chairman Shin's daughter, with quotes about finally finding stability and partnership with someone who matches his vision. Jinho read the second article on his phone at the kitchen table. He kept his face very still. He didn't realize he was shaking until Isul sat down across from him, moved the phone gently out of his hands, and placed both of Jinho's hands between his own. "Look at me," Isul said. Jinho looked at him. "He is doing this because you leaving did damage that he can't calculate and can't control," Isul said, each word deliberate. "Men like him can't stand to lose something they threw away. Don't read these. Don't let him have your mornings." Something cracked open in Jinho's chest. He pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes before anything could escape, and Isul simply stayed there, a warm and unhurried presence, not filling the silence, not rushing him through it. It was in that moment that Jinho understood. This man did not see him as a project. He did not see him as a cause. He saw him as a person who was having an extremely hard time, and he intended to sit with him through it. That was its own terrifying thing. The days after were gentler. Jinho started spending time in Isul's study, not working, just existing in the same space. Isul kept odd hours, taking calls from Singapore at midnight, reviewing contracts at 5 a.m., then disappearing for a long walk and coming back smelling like cold air. He moved through his life with a kind of quiet self-possession that Jinho had never seen in Woohyun, who had always needed to perform his success for someone. They talked. Slowly, carefully, the way you test ice before walking on it. Jinho told Isul about his childhood in Busan, about the art teacher who had told him he saw color differently than other people, about the small illustration career he had quietly abandoned when Woohyun's world swallowed his time. Isul listened the way people listen when they actually intend to remember what they hear. Isul told Jinho about building his company from a single-room office with 2 employees and a borrowed server. About the years of being dismissed as an upstart while Woohyun's empire had the backing of old money and older connections. About his mother, who had died before she could see what he built, and how he had finished the company headquarters anyway and left her portrait in the lobby. "I didn't think I'd ever tell anyone that," Isul said one evening, looking at his tea. "I'm glad you told me," Jinho said. Isul looked up. There was something in the look that was too careful, too deliberate, the look of a person choosing not to say the next thing because the timing was wrong and he knew it. They were sitting on opposite ends of the couch. Jinho's hand had drifted, without his noticing, to his stomach, that new instinctive gesture, protective and wondering. Isul noticed. He always noticed things. But he said nothing, only shifted slightly so that his shoulder was available if Jinho needed it, and went back to reading. Jinho didn't lean into the shoulder. But he stayed where he was, and that felt like something. It happened on a Sunday. Isul was making tea in the kitchen. Jinho was on the couch with a sketchbook, attempting to draw for the first time in months, when something shifted, subtle, interior, unmistakable. "Oh," he said. Isul appeared in the doorway instantly. "Are you all right?" Jinho looked up. There was something on his face he couldn't control, a helpless, stunned joy. "The baby moved," he said. "Just now." Isul went very still. "Do you want to?" Jinho began, then stopped, suddenly unsure why he had been about to say that, suddenly aware of what it meant to offer. But Isul was already crossing the room. He sat beside Jinho on the couch and waited, his expression one of such undisguised gentleness that Jinho had to look away for a second. Jinho took Isul's hand and placed it carefully against his stomach. They waited. Then, faint and definitive as a question, a flutter. Isul's breath left him all at once. When he looked at Jinho, his eyes were bright with something so unguarded it was almost uncomfortable to see. A man who had spent years being competent and contained suddenly not being either. "Hello," Isul said softly to the small life under his hand. That was the moment. That small word, aimed not at Jinho but past him, addressed to someone who couldn't yet hear it, that was the moment Jinho stopped being afraid of what he was starting to feel. Then the next morning a process server arrived at the door. The restraining order was Woohyun's signature move, elegant, vicious, technically legal. It accused Isul of harassment, claimed he had been interfering in Woohyun's personal life and business dealings. 500 feet. Legally binding. Woohyun hadn't filed it to protect himself. He had filed it to leave Jinho alone again. The restraining order made everything absurd and then, oddly, made everything clear. Isul moved his work to the small workshop behind the building, close enough to respond in an emergency, far enough to comply with the order. He set up a second router so Jinho had secure internet. He left meals on the back step with handwritten notes about reheating times, which Jinho kept without entirely meaning to. They texted. They talked through the cracked open kitchen window, 3 feet apart, Jinho leaning on the sill and Isul standing in the yard with his hands in his jacket pockets, their voices low in the evening air. One night it rained. Jinho watched the rain from the kitchen window for a long time. He thought about the paper from the clinic, still on his nightstand, still folded, with Woohyun's name in the intended co-parent field that he'd filled in before everything collapsed. He thought about the empty apartment he'd come from. He thought about the word burden and the way it had arrived in Woohyun's voice like a verdict, like a final diagnosis. He thought about Isul standing in the rain in the yard saying hello to a baby that wasn't his. He opened the back door and walked outside. The rain was cold. He didn't care. Isul looked up from the covered porch of the workshop. He started to say, "Jinho, you shouldn't," and then he stopped because Jinho's face was doing something that made further argument irrelevant. Isul came off the porch and met him halfway across the wet grass. He reached out and very carefully put his hand against Jinho's cheek. His palm was warm even in the rain. They stood there in the dark yard in the rain, 500 feet collapsed to zero, and for a moment nothing else existed, not restraining orders, not press releases, not the empire Woohyun was building on the ruins of what he'd discarded. "I'm scared," Jinho said. "Of doing this again. Of trusting someone." "I know," Isul said. "I might be slow. I have time." Jinho looked at him for a long moment in the rain. Then he stepped close and rested his head against Isul's shoulder, and Isul's arms came around him slowly, asking permission in the motion itself, and Jinho let himself be held. Woohyun held a press conference. He stood at a podium in a navy suit, his new fiancée beside him like an accessory, and he described his painful journey out of a manipulative relationship with a man who had exploited his trust and kindness. He spoke of his excitement about the Shin merger. He spoke of turning a new page. Jinho watched it on his phone, sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet because he had needed to be low to the ground. When it was over, he called Isul through the window. "Tell me what really happened," Isul said, his voice very quiet. "From the beginning. Everything." And Jinho did. He told him about the engagement, about the clinic visit, about the office and the envelope in the marble floor. He told him about the 2 years of slowly reorganizing himself around someone else's needs, about the way Woohyun had made him feel necessary right up until the moment he made him feel disposable. He told him about the things he was afraid of, about being a bad parent, about being unlovable, about the baby growing up in the shadow of a father who had called his existence a burden before it had even begun. He laid it all down, all of it, on the kitchen floor with the rain still on his clothes. Isul listened. He didn't interrupt. When Jinho finished, Isul was quiet for a moment. "You are going to be an extraordinary father," he said finally. "And you are not a burden. You have never been a burden. You are a person who trusted the wrong man, and that is the most human thing there is." Then Isul opened his laptop, turned it toward the window so Jinho could see the screen, and showed him the email that had arrived that afternoon from an anonymous source. Financial records. Internal communications. Proof that Woohyun's empire had been built, in part, on fabricated contracts, laundered funds and strategic bribes to regulatory officials. The kind of evidence that, once released, could not be recalled. "This came to me," Isul said carefully. "I haven't decided what to do with it yet. But I wanted you to know." Jinho read the subject line. He looked up at Isul through the window. "He'll know it was connected to you," Jinho said. "Yes. He'll come after your company. He'll try." Jinho pressed his hand to the glass. On the other side, Isul pressed his hand against it too, their palms aligned with 3 panes of cold glass between them. "Then let's finish it," Jinho said. The story broke at midnight. By morning it was everywhere. Kang Woohyun's name in every headline, his face above words like fraud and investigation and collapse. The Shin family issued a statement withdrawing from the merger by 9 a.m. His board called an emergency meeting. His stock fell before the market opened. Damien's world had been made of performance. This one was made of paper. When Woohyun arrived at Isul's building at 11 p.m., rain-soaked, his suit wrecked, his face stripped of all its careful architecture, he looked like a man who had finally run out of controlled surfaces to present. He looked at Jinho, who was standing in the doorway with Isul behind him. "I made a mistake," Woohyun said. The words came out hoarse, stripped of strategy. I was wrong. Come back. I can fix this. I'll fix everything. Jinho looked at him for a long time. He felt nothing violent. He felt, if anything, a profound and final tiredness, the tiredness of a body that has expelled something it was carrying too long. You didn't make a mistake, Jinho said. You made a decision. You decided what I was worth. I'm not going to spend my life arguing with that decision. Woohyun's eyes moved to Isul. His jaw tightened. He's using you. You know that. You're just... Jinho, Isul said quietly from behind him, you don't have to stand here for this. Woohyun looked at them both, at the way Jinho didn't move away from Isul, at the way Isul's hand was at Jinho's back without being possessive, just present, and something in his face collapsed, finally, completely. He turned and walked back to his car. He didn't look back. The door closed. The rain kept falling. Jinho let out a breath that felt like it had been building for months. He turned around. Isul was looking at him with that careful, unguarded expression, the one he never bothered to hide. Hi, Jinho said. Hi, Isul said. Jinho crossed the distance between them and kissed him. It wasn't a dramatic kiss. It was quiet and unhurried and entirely certain. The kiss of two people who had arrived at each other through something difficult and were not in a hurry to be anywhere else. The legal process took the better part of a year. Woohyun's empire didn't collapse all at once. It unraveled, thread by thread, contract by contract, as investigators and former partners and journalists pulled at the loose ends the leaked documents had provided. His name became synonymous with a particular kind of ambition, the kind that consumes everything, including itself. Isul's company, which had always been built on the unfashionable principle of doing things correctly, received 4 major contracts that had previously been promised to Woohyun's firm. His staff got bonuses for the first time in 2 years. He went back to taking long walks in the morning and calling his lead developers by their first names. Jinho started drawing again. He illustrated a small series of prints about the 4 seasons. Winter first because that's where he had been, and then spring gradually as the weeks turned. He sold them through a small gallery in Hongdae that Isul had found with no prompting whatsoever and mentioned so casually that Jinho only understood later what the gesture meant. On a Thursday morning in late autumn, Jinho lay in a hospital bed with Isul beside him, both of them exhausted and wrecked and unable to stop looking at the small, furious, perfect person the nurse had just placed in Isul's arms. The baby had a crinkled face and extremely strong opinions about being born. Isul held him with the careful deliberateness he used for all fragile things. He looked at the baby and then at Jinho, and something in his expression was so unguarded and so complete that Jinho felt it land in the center of his chest like a warmth that had been waiting there for a long time. You're going to know exactly what you're worth, Isul said softly to the baby. Every single day. That's a promise. Jinho reached up and took Isul's hand. The baby made a sound that was probably just physiology but felt like agreement. Outside, Seoul was cold and lit up and going on being itself as cities do. Inside the small hospital room, something was beginning. This time Jinho knew the difference.